grateful that you stayed till the end. And I'm sure Prof. Motala will be happy that there are some people here for his closing. So, So by way of introduction, Lebet has already introduced me. I just want to say a bit about our speakers for today. Our speakers are Nelson Torto, and he was the founding executive director of the Botswana Institute for Technology, Research and Innovation before he joined the African Academy of Sciences in 2017. He's got numerous accolades to his name and numerous other roles that he's played, including being a professor of chemistry at the University of Rhodes and the University of Botswana. He's also a member of the research councils in the UK. So you're very welcome, Prof. Torto.
Thank you.
Dr. Twala is the academic director for Pearson Institute of Higher Education. He is a linguist of note. He has more than 20 years' experience in education in South Africa, Swaziland, the UK, and the US. He has a highly developed understanding and has produced a lot of research on how to empower people with language skills they need for academic and professional development. He has a PhD in linguistics from UCLA. I just want to start off by making some introductory comments on the humanities. And my own background is in education and sociology and policy studies. So I think the big concerns are that a humanities education shows the importance of reflecting on the vast array of methodological and societal issues that arise from any practices. These include the technological and computational practices that underpin the fourth industrial revolution. And as we know, as has been described many times today, that critical thinking, debating, creative problem solving are all taught in the arts and the humanities. And our executive dean from FADA very eloquently put some of the big issues in terms of humanities on the table in the last session. I think this kind of critical orientation allows students to explore the complex human-to-human relations and human-to-robotics relations that we're already encountering. I think the point we want to make is it's not only the humanities that are relevant, but a lot of our discussion in the last couple of days has been about cross-disciplinary communities of researchers and educators, and this matters more than ever. I think one observation about the South African education system is that we haven't really broke down the boundaries between the sciences, let alone between the disciplines in the humanities and the arts. And I think overall, and that's what we're going to hear from our panel today, collectively we need to do more when it comes to drawing on approaches from various disciplines which will allow for quantitative reasoning, problem solving, and systems thinking that are socially relevant. I mean, I think a lot of these partnerships are happening, but not on the scale that we would like. So for this session, we had a slightly different format. I've asked the panel to prepare on two fairly general questions. And the first question is, and I think it follows very well from the last session, is that there is a lot of healthy skepticism about how the arts and humanities can benefit from the 4IR framework, and can you address this with specific reference to the African continent? So I'm going to start with Professor Torto to begin his contribution.
Thank you very much, moderator. It's quite a challenge, isn't it, to be in the last session where almost you can say that everything has been discussed. I think the previous speakers really have really touched on this issue, where clearly the role of humanities in the whole space that we are talking about has been emphasized. But I think, Masia in particular, I think he really emphasized the point that it's all about human beings. It's all about human beings. It's all about being human in the whole space of the Industry 4 and how we want to go forward. It's quite interesting that, when one looks back, maybe from the days of John Locke, one of the key epistemological thinkers of the past, that, people were grappling to try and understand what is it to be human, people like Maturana have come and they've looked into aspects of ontology, again trying to bring to the attention of people the complexity that is a human being. I know that from what Professor Motala was saying in the morning during his introductory remarks, clearly we are in a space where one can say that we are in a zone of nothingness, in the sense that we clearly don't know what is coming. We clearly don't know how things are going to redefine themselves. Things are changing very fast. We are in a space where technology really has almost taken over in terms of what we are doing. But as has been said earlier on again, that clearly everything really evolves about human beings. And of course, from an ontological perspective, we know that one of the critical aspects of being human is to be emotional. And of course, language also is very, very important because of the fact that language really defines our action. So really, we are in a space where, from an application perspective, where the aspects of a human being really play a critical role in terms of the convergence that we want to see between the sciences and the humanities, because of the fact that as long as you are dealing with things that relate to people, it means that conversations have to be there so that clearly one can be able to understand how, if they were to bring in technologies, how these technologies will impact on the different people. So, I felt that maybe the best way to answer this question was to just give an illustration of somewhat my life in terms of my involvement. I come from the science background. Obviously, I'm not an expert on issues of humanities and arts, but I'm a human being, therefore I'm in that space. So it qualifies me to comment on that aspect. So I remember, that when I came back from my PhD, when you spend your time in Europe, and in fact I did my first degree and my PhD in Europe. When you come back, one of the things that you do is that probably you can be wearing your African shirt. You really feel very African about yourself. I came back to Botswana as a chemistry lecturer. I wanted to try and see, relevance of my chemistry to what everyone else is doing in terms of the lives of people in Botswana, because obviously the aim is always to want to transform the lives of the people. So one of the things that we did with, I would say, a friend of mine, Professor Behano Abigas, was to come up with a Center of Scientific Research and Indigenous Knowledge at the University of Botswana, where we clearly wanted to see a convergence of indigenous applications and the science that we were doing. And I know that people from humanities were like, oh, you scientists, why are you looking into issues of indigenous knowledge? And we were like, no, we are human beings. I mean, before we went to the class to study chemistry, we were just human beings. And after chemistry, we go back home and we are fathers and daughters and uncles of other human beings. So clearly, we want to see our science converge with what is human. Probably I think that is one of the best things that I ever did in academia, even though there's no total link, because, roll down the years, the first indigenous knowledge policy of Botswana came from that aspect. So clearly it was a contribution because of the fact that, people began to see that our traditional knowledge was worthy of something. So you were bringing the social component to the scientific aspect in a manner that was very subtle and was not, even though it provoked the people from humanities. But, I went to Rhodes, and after Rhodes, I had an opportunity to go back to Botswana again and be a founding CEO of a research organization. So when I left Rhodes, I think I was in a space where, the idea of publications was no longer in my mind. I was, thinking of some expression that, the anti-fragility of the academia sometimes depends on the fragility of the common person. And this is from the guy who is the author of the Swan. And with that background, what I wanted to do was to go back to Botswana and really apply science with participation of the ordinary people, so co-creation. Again, in a subtle manner where, you are not aggressively bringing people from social science. So how did I do it as a founding CEO of this organization? So what I did was that, I brought in, so I decided, for us to do anything, we need to co-create with the people, but for us to be able to co-create, we need to bring in scientists who are social scientists in this space. And we did that by, setting up a component of design engineers within the research entity, simply because these are the people then who would send to the villages and now go and consult. If we want to work on something to do with water, they would ask the relevant question and understand who carries the water, where do they keep it, and so forth, so that if we are going to bring in nanotech in this space, we clearly have an understanding of how the people feel. And from that onset, it would mean that those who are going to be recipients of the technology would feel that they were party to the development of this technology. So that was the way in which I was bringing the social aspect, the humanities into the space. And of course, as a CEO, you have got an opportunity to talk to the highest level officials. So, initially when I used to go and do reporting to the president in terms of what we are doing as a research organization, the challenge was that, you'd go there and clearly want to articulate that, no, we are developing nanomaterials, we are doing this, we are doing that. And then I realized, no, the lights were switching off as far as the man on the other side was concerned. Then I realized again that in terms of my delivery, I think the social component was missing because of the fact that I wasn't really bringing in a message that related to him in a manner that you would go to village X and be able to articulate what I'd said. So this is how I was evolving as a scientist who saw the need to bring in the humanities component in the space of the science. So roll down the years, I went to Nairobi, joined the African Academy of Sciences. And of course, the African Academy of Sciences, as you know, it's a Pan-African organization. And the mandate for the African Academy of Sciences can be viewed in three components. The first one is excellence. Excellence in the sense that people are nominated to be fellows of the African Academy of Sciences. It's a privilege to be nominated. And when you get nominated, you go through the assessments using whatever criteria is used for the different disciplines, and then you become a fellow of the academy. So when I was, just before I came here for this conference, I was looking at the membership, and I've actually found that less than 10% of our members are in the 9 science areas, which was a bit alarming and of a concern to me, because we know that in the continent, so agriculture is one of the major areas where people are doing research. Biomedical sciences is the next. Then you get the biosciences, and then you get the life sciences and the rest of the other people. So clearly, if you want to make sure that humanities play a significant role, it means that from our perspective, obviously we need to do more in terms of ensuring that we bring in men and women of caliber into that sector so that they can be able to drive the agenda. So the second component in terms of the mandate of the academy is the think tank and advisory services as far as the African Union is concerned, because we work very closely with NEPAD, and NEPAD obviously is an organ of the African Union. So again, in this space, it means that all the outputs from research, they need to be put in a manner that they can be understood by the politicians, so that clearly this becomes advice for the relevant key stakeholders and government. And so again, it means that there you want to see a convergence of the science and the application where the human factor comes in. So again, it's a very critical area as far as our mandate is concerned. And the third aspect from our side is the issue of implementation of programs. Again, in terms of implementation of programs, our programs basically are very, very biased towards the science component. This is simply because of the issues that were discussed earlier on, that sometimes it's because of the fact that you get funding from outside, because we don't get funding from government, but we get funding from the Gates, the whatever of this world. And because of that reason, it means that there's a bias towards the sciences, there's a bias towards the medical component. But clearly, one wants to see one driving the sector that brings in the social sciences, so that in a way there can be a clear understanding of how some of these technologies can be applied. I think from experience, we know that when polymer material was brought into the space, without due involvement of society, we now have a crisis in terms of plastics, because no one was clearly aware that this good, innovative product would have as much impact as it is having now on the environment. We're not ready for it. I think in terms of HIV, for instance, in South Africa, there was a big issue in terms of resistance, that is caused by people not being able to take medication as they were supposed to. Again, clearly it means that you can advance on one hand in terms of bringing innovations, but you're not really bringing in the people factor in the aspect. And because of that, it means that whatever you bring, it won't be as successful as it should. There was a case in Uganda. Uganda had a crisis, again, during the HIV/AIDS time, when men in Uganda didn't want to use condoms because they were not having the same color as their skin. So even though you had advanced again in bringing a remedy for HIV/AIDS, clearly that could not be taken up because of the fact that the social component was not being brought into space. So we clearly understand, even from analysis, that in Europe, even though seemingly it seems that a lot of science is funded in Europe, but quite a bit of funding goes to the humanities side. And again, it allows the people to be able to be receptive in terms of what comes out as a product of research. My first half of next week, I'll be in Washington next week as an external board member for Company X, and we are going to be evaluating a report which concerns a survey that has been done, again, trying to see the perceptions of society with respect to science. So clearly everyone is interested in trying to get a proper understanding of how the human factor plays in the science. In the weekend that comes, I'll be in Salzburg. Again, the discussion again is around that aspect of the science and the impact on human beings. So, from an African perspective, clearly, I think we have a challenge. We've got a challenge. There's a need to ensure that we understand the space in which we are going to apply the technologies, because as it has been said, Industry 4 just doesn't speak only about technologies, but it speaks about the center of their application being the involvement of human beings. So what is our understanding of human beings, and how can we get them to play a significant role in this space?
Thanks very much. Dr. Nhlanhla?
So I'm the last one to speak. Everything has been said. So at the risk of repeating everything, I will problematize the question instead of answering it, so that we can raise questions that will force us to think about some of these issues. It's very difficult for me to speak for all the humanities because, as you all know, the humanities and the arts is everything. So we've failed to define it in a reductionist approach because it's just so broad, and so there's a problem there. So I'm a linguist, so I'll approach this issue somewhat from that perspective and then ask questions. So humanities and the arts can be looked at as a lived experience of human beings. Human beings live, they interact with various phenomena, and what is their reaction? How do they deal with that? Technology is just one of those phenomena that they will have to deal with. They have been dealing with it, actually, for each of the preceding revolutions to this one. They have dealt with it, and they've dealt it in various ways. The issue is very simple when you look from a point of view of, do human beings and have Africans extracted value from all the previous industrial revolutions? The answer is yes. And I think that I have a fear of flying, and that fear of flying does not translate to the car, but I'm more in danger in the car than in flying. Even though I know this, I still have a fear of flying. So I think that human beings will always make a cost-benefit analysis about whether to use technology and so on. So they will always interact with it in the normal, in my opinion at least, that curve where there are those who are pioneers who want to play with new technology because they are interested in gadgets. And then or any new technology that evolves, they will be able to play with it. And those who are in the middle, who are undecided, and the ones who have to be convinced later on. Okay? And I think that I wouldn't expect anything different in terms of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, in terms of how human beings are going to interact with it globally and in Africa as well. The issue is a little bit troubling when you look at it from the area of control. And then you look at it also from the point of view of democratizing what we mean by the humanities as well as what we mean by the Fourth Industrial Revolution. There is just one big problem, the problem of explaining what the humanities is outside the academy. People know what the humanities is in terms of the expression of culture, of arts, and they practice that without referring to the academy at all. So our studies of those elements is almost retrospective. We study what we see, we study what society has created, but the biggest problem is that we can't see forward. It's very, very difficult for us because our method is empirical in terms of study. We looked at the past, we struggle with projecting what is going to happen. I haven't seen even a single study in the humanities that predicted what was going to happen in the next epoch. Things almost evolve, and then we wake up, and then we study them. And so I think that that's one of the major problems in terms of the academy. There is also a problem of what we mean by the humanities, as well as what we find out about the humanities and the arts when we study them in the academy, because those findings, what we see, stay within the academy. Okay. So it's very difficult for us to project and go to people and say, okay, the fourth industrial revolution, expect this, and speak about it in a democratic way, but also infusing the theories as well as the findings that we see in that. So the one area in which the humanities does very well in terms of communicating with these things is with fiction. Who can forget 1984, the George Orwell book, where he was able to foresee the surveillance state that we are now trapped in, okay? But my fear is that we learned nothing, because the warning came, we knew what was going to happen, but here we are, stuck in it, We saw here that we are at the mercy of those who are playing with the edge of technology in terms of whether they use it for good or they use it for evil. So I think that those are the troubling questions that we have to contend with. Also, there is just a question around what we mean practically by the industrial revolution or the fourth industrial revolution within the humanities. I will admit that I don't know everything that is meant. I have a rough understanding of what it means, but I cannot, at an expert level, be in a position to delve into the subject matter and understand what it means. So this translates into the curriculum as well. How are we going to, without us in the humanities knowing in depth what the fourth industrial revolution means, what it will do, then structure the curriculum in such a way that we can impart that knowledge to the students? Okay, so in my view, these issues raise questions around curriculum reform, but as the speaker who addressed the issues of what is happening out there, maybe there's a question around control. We have always developed the curricula from a point of view that we know what the outcomes should be, and we teach from that perspective. Maybe the time has come for us to understand that in this particular case, within the humanities at least, we're not in the lead. So the issues of collaboration among faculty, as well as collaborating with students who sometimes know a whole lot more about these technologies than we do, is a model that we can look at. I would like to switch to the, in terms of just how can the humanities benefit. The humanities benefits a lot from technology. I will give just a few examples. If you look at the movie-making business, which is really a storytelling business in visual form, okay? The benefits to the humanities in terms of storytelling and how we tell stories via a visual mode are clear to see to all of us. Those who study new media are also in the era, are able to draw the benefits. You can also look at the benefits in terms of widespread communication. It's very easy now, mass communication. When I studied it and mass communication now, it's much, much more easy to reach people and reach them everywhere. So there are benefits that we can see there. In my own area of study, which is linguistics, the isolation that we used to face by having to sit in the African continent and study and make findings with other colleagues all over the world has sort of disappeared, because you can share information instantaneously collaborate with other colleagues all over the world. So we draw benefits from those. And I expect that even in the future, as the technology develops, we'll be able to benefit. The one area that has beaten us to this is business. Business is rushing ahead and doing things in terms of exploiting these benefits, which gave me chills when I was sitting listening to the speaker hear about those cameras in Discam. Because I asked myself, how many did this go through an ethics committee? Did it pass? What happened? Because you are collecting data. I haven't allowed you to collect my data, and you are figuring out all kinds of things that I don't know any of the vice chancellors. Would it get through your research committee? I doubt it, okay? But once again, in the humanities, including policymaking, we're behind. Business is rushing ahead. So I would like to echo that the benefits are many. We can list them ad nauseum. The problem here is we are behind the curve. What is happening here is that we are studying post facto, and we are trying to understand what these technologies are doing after the fact, when the damage has already been done. So, just to conclude, there are lots of benefits that we can extract as the humanities, the arts and the humanities from all the technologies, and will benefit as well. But I think that we need to wake up to the fact that somewhere along the line, we will need to be in front of this technology, not behind it. That may require us to study this field as opposed to sitting on the humanities side only. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Twala. So just following on from the two the presentations that you've made, I think the big question, and I want to follow on your issue around curriculum, I wonder if you can give us, if both of you can consider some innovative teaching and learning strategies to help disrupt the sort of the current techno talk that dominates the discussions. And I'm thinking particularly about a couple of issues. The one is, how do we build, my area is postgraduate studies, how do we build a PhD pipeline into the new era? How do we ensure that we don't build an elite pipeline, that we do create access to these new forms of knowledge and democratization of knowledge for a broader group of young people? How do we address the gender issues in terms of the pipeline? And then picking up on what you said, how do we ensure that we break the set hierarchy? The figure that you gave was really startling about who is in the Academy of Sciences. And then how do we get the buy-in from parents and from the community around the shift from specialization to more general degrees and interdisciplinary degrees in order to support a new way of doing things?
Well, it's I don't think there are obvious answers to your questions, really. I think it's a very complex situation. One can even argue whether we can meet all the needs of the fourth industrial revolution simply by following curricula in the manner that we have done it. Is it necessary for someone to have a degree? Is it necessary for someone to have a PhD, for instance? How can we do things differently? And where should we start? And who should drive what? How can we be radical in terms of our thoughts? Where can we get the confidence from? And in terms of funding, normally funding is done in a very systematic way. How can we find ourselves justifying for a new path, and how can people see value in it? Some of the biggest discovery was because of serendipity, some were because of other things, but I think we are in, as I said earlier on, I think we are in a space of nothingness where clearly our ability to learn is one of our most powerful tools, because we have to learn, and we have to learn very fast. And in that process, we need to then be able to find a pathway that we can actually be able to drive. Clearly, the human factor is core to this. But what is surprising is that, one of the things that we are driving now from the African Academy of Sciences perspective, in partnership with UNESCO and L'Oreal, is the issue of trying to see that the girl child is actually involved in the sciences. So on one hand, we want to see a convergence of humanities and the sciences, and on the other, we want to see an increased participation by the girl child in the sciences. So that in a way, there are conflicting needs. But at the same time, I think we have to be open-minded about this, because I've got a 17-year-old boy, in Pretoria at the boarding school, and clearly his thinking is totally different from mine. Because of the investments that I've made on him with PlayStations and everything else, I think his heroes are from PlayStation. It's not his uncles, and so you are dealing with a person with a totally different mindset. So am I the one to guide him in thought, or I should exercise what they call, I should exercise judgment where clearly I can only advise him along his lines of thought, which normally you would do as a PhD supervisor. So we are in that space where we don't know where we are going, but we know where we want to go, even though we don't have the components that can take us there. So I don't think it's easy. I think we are in one of the most difficult moments of humankind, in a sense, because probably we can be assisted by being open-minded, and be courageous enough to support what we see to be on the table. Because I think John Locke said, we are born with an empty plate in terms of our brain. Everything comes from wherever it comes from. But I think that saying relates to the fact that open-mindedness is what can enrich our pursuits. So I think for me, it's an issue of let's remain open-minded. Of course, we want to encourage the girl child to be in science, but at the same time, we want to make sure that people realize that science on its own cannot solve our problems without bringing in the human factor in it. We need to understand, human beings. But of course, human beings, in the olden days, I remember when we were at secondary school, if your girlfriend went to that boarding school, so it would be a letter, this month, and a letter another month, and maybe, to know that person would take a long time. Don, I see you can identify with that. But clearly, the issue that is nowadays is that within 2 hours of people meeting, the amount of ground that can be covered in text, it's amazing. You know what I mean? So I always say that I think one of the most important aspects, especially in terms of the continent, are two. One is data, and two is the youth. For you to be in that space and manipulate it properly, maybe we can be able to move in a direction that we want. But I don't have answers to your questions because I think it's a very complex scenario.
I would suggest that the first thing that maybe we would like to look at is, are we still relevant as universities? Start afresh, and ask ourselves, are we relevant? And if we are relevant, in what ways do we want to reach the audience that we have to deal with? Okay, because we have to communicate to them, and they have to understand our relevance. And then here's something that just strikes me: when you look at participation rates in Africa as a whole in higher education, they're shockingly low. Okay, and how are we grappling with that issue of access to university education if it remains relevant? Right? Because Professor Motala talked about fly-by-nights and so on. Well, maybe the problem, just like Steve Jobs told the record companies, there is piracy because your model is wrong. Okay. Maybe we should ask that question ourselves. Is it the case that our model is wrong? Okay. It certainly doesn't seem to be serving the purpose it's supposed to. We get a lot of money, but when you look at the outcomes, they are pitiful. So those are some of the things we have to look at. Then there's the question of bricks and mortar. Okay. Are we really going to cover the African situation in terms of access to education by building more universities, more bricks and mortar universities? What is the role of the hybrid model? How can we optimize that? Okay? So that the expertise of, I've always asked this question: if there is an expert professor from University X, why shouldn't the whole world have access to them? They have, so it's as though the university holds on to that expertise and says, you must pay to come to us in order to have to access to that expertise. But actually, what would be wrong with taking the best professor in mathematics, biology, and so on, and say, here is the knowledge, you can access it, and if you meet our quality criteria of attainment, you will get the education. So those are some of the things I think that these technologies are asking us to look at. Can we change our practice? Can we look at the way in which we approach education and ask ourselves, are we still relevant? I think that those are some of the questions we need to look at.
Thanks very much. I'm going to open up for questions for a few minutes. Professor, I'll take two if there's a need. Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for an interesting discussion. And I speak here as the Dean of the Faculty of Art, Design and Architecture. So these questions are uppermost in my mind and indeed in the way that we run our faculty. It seems to me that the sort of ostensible divide between the arts and the sciences, or the humanities and the sciences, is founded on some kind of fairly stereotypical notions about what it is that artists and, creative people do. This kind of notion of the sort of tortured, lone, hypersexualized genius, starving for his art. I mean, that's very much a construct of the 19th century that interestingly comes out of the first industrial revolution, but that's a topic for another day. But I think what it overlooks the way in which the arts are very much embedded, and when I use the word arts, I'm talking very broadly to encompass design as well, profoundly and fundamentally embedded in the way that we engage with the everyday world, from the spaces, the objects we engage with, all that stuff. Even the aesthetic dimension, so the fact that artists and designers play a role in just the way that things look, we mustn't forget that that has a political dimension too, because obviously, well, not obviously, but often, when contemporary cities are ugly or buildings are ugly or these things, they're ugly, and that comes at a human cost. And they're ugly because they're driven by greed and not by wanting to serve the society in. So they perpetuate unequal power relations. So beauty is not a luxury. It's in fact something that's deeply embedded in our consciousness as humans. And I think what we must also not overlook is that the role that the arts and humanities play in questions of social justice. And I think that we, so in other words, the way that imagination can be both reactive and proactive. And we see this, Klenkler gave some examples of how we see this in literature and cinema and so on. And I think I really, the point that Nelson made about that we have, or was in Klenkler, that we've kind of, we've learned nothing from the lessons of these artists and writers who've projected these challenging ideas. And it's absolutely true, so in other words, so we disregard that relationship between the humanities and the sciences at our own peril. So you think of something like Chernobyl, very much in our minds at the moment. I don't know how many watching the Showmax series. But of course, that disaster, you can trace it back to the fact that there was a human dimension. That reactor failed because of a complex set of human interactions that were about, power, about authority, about not being adequately trained, about putting people in places where they really shouldn't have been. And it has this massive disaster. The Boeing 737 MAX, the same story. Sure, you can say the reasons for it is the failure of certain artificial intelligence and algorithms. Actually, it's about greed. It's about the fact that the designers were not wanting to go to the expense of training the pilots to deal. Anyway, I'm rambling. So just to get back to the point that I want to make, I think that, so this idea that if we want to see, as Nelson says, to see art and science converge, I think that has to happen with a kind of, it also responds to some extent to Shireen's point about how we do bring this into curriculum. I think it means a sort of a profound epistemological shift in curriculum that focuses not on industry 4.0, but on society 4.0. For me, Industry 4.0 is an instrument of neoliberal capitalism. It acts upon us. It interpolates us. You talk about the cameras in Dischem. I mean, it's horrific. you know. And we kind of left just kind of defenseless against that. You shift the whole way of thinking towards society 4.0, and that's about a reminder of embodiment, of agency, of the fact that we have the volition to act independently. You know, so I mean, these are big abstract things, but I think that this is that if you're going to see, if we're really going to be responding to the challenges of the fourth industrial revolution, is going to require that. It's going to require a fundamental rethinking of curricula, and it's going to be about breaking down those spaces between the science and the humanities, and to in fact recognize that there's much less of a gulf there than we think there is, if only we're willing to view it in a different way. Sorry, so not so much a question as a, as a set of comments, but I suppose there are questions wrapped up inside.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I agree with the last speaker, of course, not entirely, but his arguments toward the notion of the unity of science, for want of a better word. You know, that's one thing, in my view, the fourth industrial revolution has helped us to kind of begin to acknowledge and comprehend better. You know, I mean, it's a notion that has always been there, but then we've had these disciplinary boundaries. You know, Castells refers to them as a peace treaty amongst academics. I want to be a sociologist, I want to be a political scientist, I want to be this and this. But with the fourth industrial revolution, we're beginning to see these things in a very encompassing fashion, which is quite good in my view. But I have a question not necessarily to the panel, but to all of us in this group. This thing around the humanities. And my view is probably the humanities, you know, they've not achieved their promise. We talked about critical thinking as something that comes out of the humanities. We talked about creative systems thinking as something that comes out of the humanities. We talked about emotional intelligence, writing skills and communication skills. Yet every time we do employability studies, these are the things that are lacking. You know, be it in humanities students themselves or even the other students. What is it that the humanities is not doing to achieve its promise? Our students cannot write. Our students and ourselves cannot think critically. We are so blinkered. You know, our emotional intelligence is problematic. Yet these are the things that we are told humanities, you know, helps us to acquire. So what aren't we doing in the humanities? Are we going to blame the quality of the students? I don't think so. Thank you.
Can I respond to that?
Thanks. Is there another question? Yes, sure.
Okay. One of the very interesting things about the humanities and the social sciences is that it has focused on critique. Okay? And most of the time, the critique is self-interested. It's almost like a circular discussion among the professors, you know, the professorate within those fields. One of the proposals, or I've seen lots of people coming out now saying, is that in order for the humanities to remain relevant, it has to adopt a new tech, right? And that tech means demonstrating its value to society other than just sitting and critiquing society, right? Because the critique leaves you helpless. It's like you are doing this wrong, there is this power here, there is this unfairness here, and so on. Then it goes like, okay, what do we do about it? And then we go silent. So I think that we are on the right issue here of how can, in the humanities, we make ourselves more relevant to the issues of the day, including what we are pointing out as in within the academy itself. How does the humanities then fulfill its promise across the academic spectrum, if it is indeed true that all of these issues, like critical thinking, writing, and so on, emanate from the humanities? Or alternatively, they can be anywhere, except that you can just teach them to those people who do different fields. So I think that I agree with you that there's an issue there, but I think that within the field itself or within the area, people are beginning to realize that we may need to change our own tech in terms of what we do in order to promote, relevance of the humanities.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that if we were to have the distinctions of humanities and the sciences on the other hand, clearly, I think, and then also have the qualities within those distinctions, I think what one would want to see a situation where the guy who is driving innovation in the science sector would have the empathy that comes from understanding human beings, that comes from the other component. Obviously, it's a unique situation, but I think you'd want that to be something that is within the way that the innovator does things, so that there can be empathy. In the sciences, there's a famous story about Archimedes. When he discovered the issue of volume and weight, and he ran in the streets. I think the illustration there was that, because the scientist is dressed in his own ideas. I mean, that is the most powerful thing. The guy didn't realize that he was naked because obviously the ideas were more important. Maybe that's why sometimes they say the scientists don't have a good dress sense, because their ideas are more important. But clearly, one wants, it hits to the factor of the Boeing aircraft that sometimes, the coolness of the algorithm overrides everything else. Whereas you want to bring in the softness that comes from a different understanding, so that, the coolness of the algorithm for this aeroplane can be seen in a broader context, where clearly one would say, what would be the impact on human beings, if we do this, et cetera, rather than just relying on the correctness of what one has done. So I think there's a challenge there. There's a challenge clearly to bring up a different group of professionals where these qualities are within what they are doing. And we know very well that the issues, sometimes, even if you look at in terms of how proposals are written, it's an issue of bringing in someone when you think you need them. Whereas if you were to look at the problem at the beginning, maybe the person who you are bringing in at stage X would have a different perspective of how the project should be addressed in terms of its development. So these are some of the things that I think people in academia, people who are looking at coming up with solutions, really are grappling with, because of the fact that we are used to doing things in a certain way, we are used to following certain rules, and we are not in a position where we can want to be too open-minded about this and accept that we can learn from each other, because those who are not in the room cannot influence how the project is going to proceed. What we are basically, I know when I was a professor at the university that scientists would write their proposal, and when it's almost finished, they say, but we need a guy from humanities to do this and this. Then they bring the person in. Whereas if you had brought the person at the beginning, maybe you'd be having a totally different project.
Thanks very much. I'm going to go to my last question, and it's a very simple question.
Okay.
And I suppose it's a good question for the conclusion of the conference. But given that we are talking about Africa and the significant development priorities that we have around energy, food security, access to education, human capital development, peace and conflict, and the whole range of things. We have Sudan on our doorstep, very much uppermost in our minds at the moment. Can you give me 2 or 3 examples of where the humanities and the sciences can collaborate within a 4IR framework in order to address some of these big development priorities that we face, so that we have a sustainable future?
I thought about poverty. I think that poverty is a theme. It's part of the Millennium Development Goals we will miss, I think. We're bringing together all the expertise that we have could be a good place to start, okay? How do we solve the problem of lack of resources, safety, security, Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Because it's really embarrassing. We're practically the only continent left now where we're still dealing with the fundamental issues at the bottom of just safety and security. So I think that if the academies or the universities in Africa really wanted to solve or make themselves relevant, harnessing all the knowledge that we have, Professor Marwala mentioned that we're still struggling with electricity, which was in the second industrial revolution. How do we catch up? Jumping some of the steps, when you look at the story of communication technology, we have done phenomenally in the sense that we skipped the landline and went straight into telecommunication in the modern age. Can we replicate that in the solving of poverty in our space? Because solving poverty then will force us to deal with multi-factors that affect it, education, resources, the economy, and so on. So I thought that would be one example of a common theme that we could come across from all divisions and work on in order to address these issues.
Thanks very much.
Well, I think in addition to that, we can also look in terms of aspects of health, for instance. I think health is a critical area for the continent. I think we have some common diseases that are facing the continent: HIV, AIDS, malaria, for instance, and then we've got NCDs, non-communicable diseases, and we've got other also diseases that could benefit from the collaboration amongst people in the continent, where it's not just about the science, it's not just about the innovation, but it's also about the way of life, the way the human beings plays a critical role in some of these aspects in terms of, for them to be able to address whatever comes from the innovation, or, and also, be able to adjust and do things differently in terms of their day-to-day living, so to speak. Because, again, that's where the human factor comes in. I know that, we face challenges from time to time, whether it's new technologies relating to mosquito nets or different aspects that relate to repelling mosquitoes to be able to address issues of malaria. We know, of course, that the antimicrobial resistance is a big deal now because of the fact that I was watching, it was on YouTube, where in Ghana they have come up with a song to try and discourage people from getting antibiotics from chemists, because these antibiotics, obviously, a lot of people are consuming antibiotics. The advantage of having running water is that the wastewater goes to a central point. So obviously, it means that our wastewater systems have got a lot of antibiotics. This brings up a lot of resistance to drugs. And it means that in the future, many of the common diseases are going to come back because of the fact that there won't be anything to cure them, because of the fact that everyone has been going to the pharmacy and getting this and this. I know when I used to live in Sweden, even a painkiller, you couldn't get it. I think the only person who could get a painkiller was a lady, and you can associate that with period pains. But a guy, you can't go to the pharmacy and say you want a painkiller, because they were associating that to be a drug of abuse as far as that group is concerned. So I think for the continent, we are going to face a serious problem regards to resistance because of the fact that there's abuse of antibiotics in our daily lives.
Thanks very much. I'm going to take the last few questions. Are there any questions? There's a lady over here, I think. Anybody else? Thanks, you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you. There's just a point that this has triggered in me that I was relevant to a summit I was at recently. And it was actually during our International Week at Rhodes, and we had a summit called Imagining a Borderless SADC Region. And we got different people to come in and look at the economic, trade, immigration, all of those issues in this region. And one of the things that came up was, if we were to address something like poverty or human security, the actual issues that are in, we were looking specifically at this region, but I think it applies across Africa. The issues of human security that people actually face, for example, versus the allocation of government resources, are vastly different. So you've got government resourcing going towards a security agenda that might be more about, militaristic security or immigration and security, whereas it's precisely issues like HIV, malaria. Those are the things that impact on actual human security in Africa. So we just haven't mentioned, we've been looking at the academy, we've been looking at human, but we've not talked about the state. And there definitely is a great disparity between where the state is allocating resources and where the politicians are putting emphasis. and the addressing the actual needs. So I just wanted to kind of put that into the discussion a little bit. I know we're coming to the end of the day, but just note it. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. That was a very good question. It's sort of the unspoken question that I think is in all our minds. Are there any other questions? Is there a final question from anybody? If not, over to the panelists for their final concluding comments.
Thank you very much. Just on the issue of the state, I've long given up on the state, so, because I think the political dynamic to me is a little bit difficult to understand. So I look at society and agents in society who can make a change without relying on the state, and the state can then be driven by human agency on the ground. So practically, that's my point of view. As a final comment, I think we're in a great space in terms of what is possible. The question that remains in my mind is whether we have the will and the courage to actually do what we can do in terms of the university sector, making itself more relevant to the people that we serve. We are not serving ourselves, we serve the people out there. And if we can find a way of reconnecting with them and finding a way of being useful to them, I think that is going to make both the arts and the humanities and technology something that they will see as a net benefit. Finally, constrain the evil streak that sits in there. Interestingly, there is a Nobel laureate who won the Nobel Prize for nudge economics. So when they did, I went into that and I wanted to find out what it is. And I was amazed at what nudge economics holds in terms of its potential for good and for evil. And if you want to know more about it, just watch your Discovery Health nudging to do things. As you can be nudged positively, you can be nudged negatively. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, I think for me, in terms of the state, obviously, I think one of the things that I learned when I was working for government was that every government is a political government. If you are really there in the presence of power, you can clearly feel that. And anything else that you say would not make sense if it's not aligned to that. My last point really is that I think the human factor in all this that is Industry 4 is very, very important. Empathy is one of the emerging attributes that will build a culture that will help us get to where we want to get to. And I think one of the things that I've discovered, I'm a jazz enthusiast, and I still, buy, gramophone records if I can find them, because I've got a gramophone that works. But what I want to say is that, some years back, people felt, the CD has taken over. But I think, for those of you who pass via record shop, I think you'll now find that records are back, and they're back in a big way. And you know why? Because some of us who play records is the human factor. You are interacting with the music. You're interacting with the whole setup as you are playing music, and that has made records, a thing of the future rather than of the past. So I think it's a way that reflects what was said earlier on. That it's understanding human beings, because after all, it's that component that drives what would be bigger, newer innovations because of our engagement and our interaction with them. So, we still grapple with understanding what is it that is a human being. But the more we ask ourselves that question, I think the more we open up for possibilities to be able to do more as human beings. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So, by way of conclusion, I want to thank the two panelists. I think the discussion from the panelists and from the floor have been extremely wide-ranging. And I think the big issues that came up, which Dr. Twala raised, was the issue of relevance. What is the future of the university? What should the university look like? The issue of breaking down barriers and having access to learning wherever you are. The issue of hybrid, blended learning. I think the other big issue, which you very soberly brought to us, is that we do have a long way to go. And I think from the floor there was a question that we also need to critically introspect on the humanities. Are we actually doing all these things? Critical skills and problem-solving skills, etc. But I think the big issue that came out from all of us, and I think where we concur and where we can end, is the issue of the university and its societal relevance. And how do we contribute to the public good? And as Prof. Freshke said, maybe it's time to move from Industry 4.0 to Society 4.0. So thank you very much for a great session.
Thank you.
Thank you, Boti. Thank you. Thank you.